Good afternoon. Many of you know me as the clown, Lloyd, who enjoys being in front of an audience. But as we know that we're here for a serious matter this afternoon, Randy asked me to talk a little bit about heavy lift. And so I tried to figure out how we could carry on with what Chase talked a little bit about the legal system and putting that where there was a death involved and how heavy lift was involved. I've been involved in a couple of cases over the past couple of years, both of which have settled, in which I do not know the end result. All I know is I got paid and they thanked me for what I did.
If we just let
Did admit?
yeah, just click admit. Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. I didn't know I was going to be technology.
No, I can do it. Yeah, sure.
We're good. And
Okay.
so some of us are doing expert witness, some of us have not. And we heard from Chase yesterday a little bit about what the questions are asked, how do you respond to the questions? And one is in a timely manner, but it takes a lot of time. It doesn't matter what you're involved in. And so what we're seeing here is that we're seeing a dredge that was in a coal mine, surface mining operation in Spokane, Washington. What happened was this dredge sank. The dredge sank because there's no requirements, no Coast Guard requirements or any kind of inspections on these inland lakes because they're all private lakes or considered private lakes. So this dredge was modified to, I'll put a pointer on it.
I gotta get out.
I don't know who that is. But I'm gonna put a point here. So this section of the dredge was added on and it was converted from a Caterpillar 3412, which ran all the electric pumps, the cutter head and all, and converted to this electric. And I'm gonna show you a picture that they had almost 3,000 feet of submarine cable to this site. So kind of the layout is, it ended up being a lawsuit, which was filed against this citronella in the fatal drowning of Caleb Brown. So a little bit of the history of that. We'll get to that. Here's the dredge and how it was found. Caleb had just had the experience of being on the dredge. He'd only been on it for 21 or 26 days, limited training. They had safety meetings prior to this event leading up to what happened. The supervisor said the stern of the dredge was 1 inch underwater and that he needed to pump the dredge out. Okay, so when that dredge sank, and we're going to see this in a little bit, this is a set. Hold on, let me go back up to the dredge because it helps a little bit with the description. Those that are in the electrical business understand what voltage means. That transformer was a 7,200 volt transformer. And so when he went on the dredge, he said the starboard stern corner was underneath of 1 inch of water. And so so he got on the dredge. He forgot his radio. He called on the radio through the door of the radio, called, and they brought him a radio. 30 minutes later, there was a contact that this dredge was not pumping, but just water, clear water. So something had happened. And as we find out, a lot of other things happened in this matter of time. Only about an hour of the event. So during this event, Caleb was doing his job. He went to get the pump. And some of the questions that I asked when I read this first document, you can see here is, mine safety had been on that dredge 1 month before, issued notices of deficiencies, never followed up on the deficiencies. But think about this. If we're issued notices in the real world, not a company that hires 400 people, pumps a pile of money into the economy, and it's owned by 3 Dover, Delaware companies or Wilmington, Delaware companies. So they're underneath the shield of Dover, Delaware in Washington. And the second was a suction dredge operating when it sank, which we knew it was. However, when you look at the electrical switches in there, you saw switches were turned off or safety equipment was not on board, such as bilge pumps, such as high water bilge alarms, things in which in commercial operations, and Kenner knows this, without subchapter M in the tugboats section, we wouldn't have had high water bilge alarms. Now we have to have them and they're checked all the time. And there are a lot of fines that are issued on spot checks because of this. But so when I got this document from the lawyers, it was like, what are we going to do And the first question I had was, where's the daily logbook? The logbook of the shift inspections and the safety meetings, because that was my job to investigate this. Now, this happened a couple years later after the incident happened, so I was recreating or having to read the documents again. The first time I met with the lawyers, it's kind of like when you went on your first date. They didn't want to give you any information because they couldn't trust you. The second time I talked to them, they started saying, "Oh, we got a few more pictures for you." By the third conversation, I had a whole document file of safety records, mine safety inspections, and that. But it still goes back to all of the parties in this group. These were the parties. Colview Recovery Dredging, Colview Centralia. All three of these companies were under contract to the mine to run the mine. So we started getting into this, and then all of a sudden I had to figure out who was who. And so when you, like yesterday, Chase was talking about, you have to understand what your job is and how you do your job. So these are the questions that we started with as I started moving through all this. So then I'm gonna get down to. So there was an emergency call at 9:54. And at approximately 10:28, the rescuers stopped the efforts looking for Mr. Brown. Why is that? They said the weather conditions are bad. Well, as most of us, I don't know how many are divers in our group, but when you have something like this and you know that this guy is close to that dredge, he's not going to be far from the dredge. He's going to be within right on the deck. He's going to be on the side of it, but he did have a life jacket on. So that means that he would have floated. It says rescue diver located about who was wearing a flotation device at 2:35 the next day. So that means if he had the life jacket on, he would have floated on the surface even with the dredge sank. So that would give me an indication that, hey, look, he was maybe trapped in the pilot house or the cabin. So that was a question that we worked through on that. And then there was another part there.
You go back to that, they found him in the dredge operator's compartment.
In the dredge operator station, yeah.
So he was on the vessel.
He was on the vessel. He
And
had
they
not,
didn't find him like
no,
earlier the day before?
no, they didn't find him that night. They didn't go looking into it because they said that the starboard door, and there's a video says the starboard door was open and closed easily, which I saw because it didn't have a handle on it. And the other doorknob to the port side, they said the water pressure had held it. Well, it was equalized water pressure. So it shouldn't have been too difficult.
Yeah.
And if Caleb Brown was in the operator station, would you not have thought with all that shit in there that he would have broken the window out? I'm just common sense.
Would you have looked in there when you checked to see the door?
If I was a diver, I would have, if I was a diver, I'd have shined a light in there and see if I saw something floating in there. And we'll see a picture of that in just a minute.
So you think he got hit or trapped and he was unconscious and he couldn't do it?
Well, we're going to talk about that too. So the medical examiner in his report said he drowned. So I go look for the medical examiner's report, and the medical examiner has amnesia. There's no pictures of Mr. Brown, which is pretty important. And there's no autopsy of Mr. Brown. And they cremated his body within a couple of days. So there was no follow-up. But you remember, this case didn't happen for a couple of years because, you know, it was kind of an uncertainty type of thing. But so this is where, right here, this is the one that got me the most right here. So when that lawyer said yesterday, they try to do all their due diligence to settle these cases out of court. This is what I talked to our law firm about. It says, I do not want to go before jury or go before these other people that were experts, because then all these other questions will come up. I don't know how the negotiations went, but I said it would be pretty bad to be on the stand. You start pointing fingers at mine safety, you start pointing fingers at the sheriff, the coroner for the documentation, and then and follow up, and then all of a sudden that would probably raise a pretty good shitstorm. So, so then we're going to go up in here. These are all the documentations on the 29th, and then it took 2 months. This is back to Randy's question about heavy lift. Why did it take 2 months to get this dredge up? Remember, it's a shoebox dredge, just like an Ellicott or Ellicott dredge. So it's 2 pontoons. It's got a shoebox in the middle. And they don't pump up very easy. But there was also some other extenuating circumstances too, is that two compartments had holes or rust throughs that nobody fixed. Mine safety missed it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't say it needed to be documented. And the other thing was, as soon as that shoebox filled up with water, we're getting to the point of what happened. The lawyers that I was working for, they took for granted everything there about this guy drowned based on being in the cabin. But what happens when you get electrical shock? They say if you get shocked, you become part of it, or you get stuck, or you see electrical current going through there. But how many have been underwater and grabbed a hold of a propeller on a ground wire or a loose ground or open ground? It's going to sting the shit out of you. You're gonna. So, and if you remember Kevin Ritz, a lot of us know about Kevin Ritz and the story of his family, is that, you know, his son unfortunately swam off of a pier and swam into an electrical field and became immobilized and drowned. And he talks about this very openly and freely, and I've heard his conversation several times. And I felt when I saw this, it's very similar to why there weren't any signs of an electrical shock. It wasn't, but they stood, the attorneys I was working for had stood behind all the mine safeties documentation and all the other experts that said, hey, look, this was a drowning. And we're going to get to that. So we had the location, depth of the hull, and we're going to get to where the dredge was.
Hey, Lloyd,
Yes, sir, go ahead.
so the mining company owns this barge.
The mining company contracted with
Contracted.
TransAlta and Coalview and Centralview, yes.
So like OSHA, even though they have jurisdiction over the mining company, would not have.
Mine safety,
Mine safety, that organization. right?
mine safety had jurisdiction over it, but they were non-water qualified people. And so let me get to this and we'll follow up on that. So if you look right here, here was the dredge. See where the little yellow dot is? That's the dredge. There was an electric cable that ran from this dredge underwater to a shunt. What do you call those things? Like a ELCI or GFCI on the ground. Those are oil-filled shunt. So during the investigation, that shunt that was right there, or safety switch, was bypassed. So as we start putting this together, you start saying, okay, well, why did this? We're starting to get the parts and pieces now, but it took a month to get all the pictures. So as that went through here, this is where the finger was. They talk about all the pictures in the road. Because once they were pumping this here, they were pumping it up into a processing facility for this coal to be refined and made into coal ash or coal product so they could burn it into the electric power plant there. So back to your question there,
Who's the regulatory body?
mine safety? Mine safety was regulatory body. They're the ones who did the inspections. They're the ones who noted the cable. We didn't have any samples of the cable. All we had was in their reports that there were cables that had been damaged and ends, and they said they were improper. So here's the dredge itself. Regular shoebox dredge, excuse me. Regular shoebox type of dredge, whereas you have your pontoons here with watertight compartments. You had your open box here, which the control station was on top, and then your open area here for your water and your slurry to come, and then your ladder. And then across was the electric processor with the welding machine and the transformer in which this was all powered into. So this was the pump, pumped it off to the shore. So this area here, as you know, here there's supposed to be a bilge pump here, a bilge pump here, a couple bilge pumps in here, and these were supposed to be sealed compartments with deck hatches that were sealed, and these had two deck hatches here. So all of those were sealed and locked, or supposed to be. Well, when I saw the pictures, somebody did a great job of taking pictures, and there's the dredge again. Here's the dredge sitting out of the water. So one of the things that I looked for, because of when the guy said, what were the freeboards at the time of the event? So I looked for a line, a permanent line that went down the side, and then where the transformer was sitting on the back of the dredge. So I was looking at, I stood back from the picture. I'll never forget Steve Knox always said, stand as far away as you can, get a picture of it, and get those 4 pictures around it. So when you sit down in front of your computer and you start narrowing in on your pictures, you can look at those areas that you start narrowed in, and you can start making assumptions, and not so much assumptions. You can see defined water lines in this dredge. And they had multiple water lines, as you can see. You can see it how it's angled, where you can see across the back of the dredge, where you can see like that's about 6 inches of freeboard down to about 16 inches of freeboard, and that's because of the way of the transformer. And then here's the side of the dredge. You can see we got our deck hatches along the sides that were reported, your ladder, your house, your control house that was there. And look at this difference in the water line. So the reason why the water line was adjusted is as soon as the ladder was on the ground, the center of gravity moved further back because the weight of the cutter head was on the bottom cutting. And so that weight was more or less being supported by the ground, and the weight of the transformer was pulling the dredge out. So that's why you see a little bit of offset on these lines. And there's the differences between the two water lines when it's an actual working dredge. And there's your 3 water lines. And I think when he said it was about 3 to 4 inches, that must be the freeboard that he was talking about. So then they got into the conversation of, was this transformer certified to be on a waterfront operation? Because it had an open bottom, it wasn't sealed. So they went to the dredge company and asked them why they use that. And there's a company in North Carolina that I rode by one afternoon. I looked and they were redoing transformers, and I saw a lot of them like this. And I called the company up and I said, do you make these waterproof for waterborne operations? They said no. So that was one thing that I think the lawyers and the defense lawyers were trying to use, that this transformer was not suitable for this job. But they used it and operated 2 years before any incident. And so as you can see, the dredge, the back of the dredge, the door, these were the doors with no handles on them, which they were talking about. They couldn't open the doors. The windows were sealed tight. So there's one thing here. Let's see if I can zoom this picture up. Oh, I can't zoom in on this. Hold on. Damn.
You can increase the screen size.
You damn palm bastard. Use my damn.
Behind PC.
Hold on, I just got to grab this thing here. So one of the things that was the trigger for this, see if I can get this to zoom up a little bit over here on the right hand side. Has anybody ever seen blistered paint on metal after you welded or you've done any work on a painted surface?
Anytime there's hot work on the interior or something.
Yeah, so let me see if I can get this picture of on. Y'all see the blisters? You look careful. I don't know if you can see. It might need to turn the light on. But this whole transformer was nothing but one big blister of paint. So if you take a welding machine and you weld the back side of it on the hull side, you're going to see a blister, right? That blister was in the electrical cabinet. That whole cabinet was electrified so hot that when it tripped, that breaker, it not only blew out 7,500 watts, sank that dredge. It blew out 100,000 volt transformer, which powered that whole end of the city. None of that was recorded until the lawyers, one of the lawyers' dad, who was an electrical engineer, when he supported the findings here that, hey, look, you know, he's on to something on this. So when somebody asks you what your opinion is, be very reserved until you know the facts and you put the facts on the table. But right there, when I saw that blistered paint, having welded and saw these water lines, that as soon as that guy walked, he put the bilge pump in the wrong compartment. Let me shrink this back down. He put the bilge pump in the wrong compartment, which was this one here. He put the bilge pump in that compartment. Instead of putting it in this compartment here where there was three cracks in the hull. And by the time he walked from here, got back into the cabin. Maybe 20 feet, 25 feet there. So by the time he walked from here to here and got in the cabin to call on the radio to answer, he could not move because the water had filled up the shoebox. The motors that were driving the pumps were done. I have a little more documentation, but I kind of cut that part up so we could talk about this other one too, about where we, with another type of lift. But so this was, unfortunately, you know, when we get involved sometimes in these cases, even though it's heavy lift and we think it's fun to go do ships where you're unloading motor yachts that are damaged or you're doing cables off of barges. Sometimes these come across your doorstep and you get these cases because you did a good job on another one, or it's a point of reference. I mean, Randy, you've probably done more of this and some of the other guys have done more, but this was kind of one of those cases where if you stuck behind the corner and you didn't have enough thought of or understanding of what electricity would do on a piece of metal. And I asked the company, the group, I said, do we need to replicate that? Because I had a transformer company that said, we'll build the model for you and we'll do this. And they said, we don't need to go that far. Because as soon as that lawyer's dad said, hey, look, I'm positive that this is what happened. So I'm not sure how the end result was because it was one of those closed operations.
Behind the computer there.
Is that where they are? Perfect. All right, so now we're gonna whip up this other one here that's kind of a unique one.
You need to stop the share first.
Okay, we need to stop this share and we're gonna share another one here that where the surveyor's role was very valid, and I'll explain a little bit about this. Some of the guys around Charleston will know about this one here. Come up. It's coming, it's working. Okay,
Hang on.
we're good. So this one here was a little bit different situation. However, it was one where
This one? No, that one.
the Addy, yep, where everybody had amnesia on this case. It happened. A young fella was running the boat. He didn't have his life jacket on. He was laying on the back of the ladder going up the back. And he was part of the dredge crew. So they were rotating the dredge crew and operators. And on the 25 footers or 26 footers and under, you do not have to have captain's license to run them or mariner's papers to run them. And there was no training for these guys when they were running this boat. So he was running as he was asked to do. When I went to see the boat the first time, it had just been painted, the engine room, new motors, everything had been finished, restored, and it was back working in the water. This is the case that how they talked about it, and good thing they don't mention us in the case, but this did happen. So these were the lawyers, and this is how they presented the case in the District of South Carolina through Division of Admiralty. And how the case was spelled out. And then these were the files. So this is back to what Chase was talking about. When you're asked to review files, review things, he gave me the outline of what he wanted me to do. Where the other group said, here's the documentation, you put together a presentation for us, and then this is what we want to do. So they gave me, these were my instructions to participate in that. And then we did do a vessel inspection a little bit later on September 8th, which a little bit later on, and then we did that. So this was the vessel. This was the vessel right after it was hauled out of the water. There's a hull ID number. This was the dredge working. So this dredge was hooked in to this left-hand picture, helping as an assist tow. They were hooked into right there. And as they were going up the river, right outside of the battery, that tug tripped, which means it hooked and it flipped over. So the deckhand was able to get outside. The fella running the vessel was trapped inside. And that's where they found him. And this was the Coast Guard doing their due diligence. And of course, you know, they have to be all over the boat and they have all their assumptions. They could not provide us a report because it's, as they say, it's under investigation. You can see the condition of the ropes, which didn't have anything to do with the boat tripping. It was just an operator issue, and it's that mean tide they have in that Charleston River. But this was an interesting picture. If you look at this picture of the throttle position, that guy was going full ahead forward. Those John Deeres were getting it all they could do, and that's what that dude was told. So, and look at the rudder point. That was another contention that I had, is with this rudder being the tiller arm hard over, is that he was turning that, and it just, as it went through, just based on a shopping cart theory, you know, when you push it and you turn right, it's going to turn right. So that's what was going on. And then there's the rudders. So this was how the boat was found. But when you went to talk to the tugboat captain and everybody, they had amnesia. Everybody with the crane had amnesia. This was a pretty important picture. Sell those bilge pumps. There's there's 5 bilge pumps, I think, or 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we went inside the bilges to look for these bilge pumps, because, you know, of course, all the switches say they're off. That's a pretty good indicator that nothing was working. Here's from the builder, because they wanted to point the finger at the builder because they didn't have enough bilge pumps or high water bilge alarms in the engine room. There was a general alarm. That switch was turned off. I guess it became a nuisance. There's the alarm. That's for smoke in the engine room. This is your battery switch. So you can see that the general maintenance of this vessel is not very good. So this is the only bilge pump that was in the bilge, and when you turn on the switch, it did not work. None of the bilge pumps in this boat worked. Everyone was disconnected. You can see here where the wires were corroded off. That's the battery that's turned upside down. Sorry about that. When it sank, the battery turned upside down, and that's the wires. So I was looking at all these pictures, and they were asking me what my opinion was, because the Coast Guard had one opinion, and we ended up with this bellows. See the hose right here? Somehow that hose got kicked off on that shaft lock. This hose, and we'll see a picture of it, did not have a hose barb on it. All it had was the barrel on the end of it with a ring on it. So any hose would slide on and off. And the hose clamp was an oversized hose clamp, so it would not seat tight on the hose to hold the hose in place on the hose barb. Hopefully I'm making a little bit of sense with this, but there's the hose barb right there. This is what the Coast Guard's opinion was. There's very little hose barb, because you can see the mud. Still don't understand, if it's got all this mud running out of it, how it could be flooding the boat. But I guess with all the torque and they were turning the boat, my opinion was that the boat tripped in a turn and got the deck underwater because it didn't have any hatches and it got up there. But they did say that they would go down and they would check the bilges all of a sudden, and the deckhand said we had a problem, and they did have a problem. But lack of training. Here's the hose that should have been fitted on there. You can see the hose barb is nothing to it. And if you put a 5/8 hose clamp on there, you can pull it right off. We did that demonstration and there's the mud that came out of it. These are the vents that they said deck drains. But I'm gonna get over here too. This was our Coast Guardsman trying to prove his point. There's your heavy lift. So Randy, I did have a picture of a heavy lift in here off the bottom. So this was done by the heavy lift company in Charleston. That's how the boat was found. And they picked it up, put it on a barge, and carried it over to their downriver facility, and that's it. Been lifted. But that crane operator had amnesia. The tug captains had amnesia. And so it's left up to the surveyor to put together a scenario or analysis or synopsis that he could defend, or the attorneys could defend in their court case. As you can see, it filled up with mud. That was the Coast Guard had to go dig mud, which I thought was pretty good on their part that they did part of the job. They documented everything. Here's the stern bilge pump. The wires were disconnected on it. And it did get a little bit of mud in it, but not as much mud as it looks like it was there. But you can see the water lines as you go through these pictures. With the mud, there's the cable, the power cord. Here's the mud that sat on the decks. Here was the freeboards. We're trying to find a freeboard. Remember, we talked about the freeboard in the dredge. Freeboards on tugs and barges are very important when you have these type of incidents. This was after it was clean. You could tell that, you know, it was normal, regular water that they'd used as stern ballast. But as you can see, nothing was working. So the tug company had their representatives there. They had their surveyor there when they did this inspection, and then when I was there. But here was something that was interesting. Why would you have a 16-inch anchor chain, Kenner? Isn't that at 120 pounds of length anchor chain in the back of that lazarette? They were using a stern ballast. So we got another picture of it. You can see it right there.
What size is it? Inch and a half?
16-inch, inch and a half. Yeah, it's like 120 pounds of length or something like that.
I know a shop weighs about 1,700 pounds.
Yeah.
90
So they were using this for stern ballast, and you can see it got shifted around. But so with water, so we know that the stern needed to be digging in a little bit more than it was, which we find is a common thing. And then I went into the forward tank. This is the forward bilge, and had diesel fuel in it. Still haven't figured out how the diesel fuel got there, unless when it went down, the vent line was not connected and it vented into the bilge, but it was a sealed tank. And there's the water line that was in that forward compartment, and it had been there because I think they sank this dredge down to intentionally to get water in it, to get more weight for the propellers. And then there's your hatch to go into the engine room. This was the specifications. So back to the specifications, this was the dredge that or the boat was purchased. We talk about the systems. So as you start putting this together with your pictures, you got a lot of things to think about. I mean, it took a while to work with this group. There's the stability because we said it wasn't stable, but the stability chart was not calculated with the chain in the stern and all the water ballast they had put in it. And there's and that was one of the things that I emphasized to the attorneys. I said this stability chart does not explain how much water was in this boat, and the freeboards do not match up with the stability chart. So you have to understand stability. Let me get to this was the sister boat, so it shows you how it was working. See how tender the boat is because they have those raised pilot houses and they like to turn over because it's so the center of gravity of this is not the same as that was calculated. Here's the Miss Ann, similar boat, and there's the Addie Kate. And so the Captain William was a traditional boat. The stability, the center of gravity was lower. And so here's a little bit of discussion about it. What they were doing, the cis boat, there's the tow. Addie Kate, when she was tied, there's a barge right here with the heads of these pipes right here, and she was tied right there. And she was pushing through right by the battery in Charleston. So they had one on each side to help steer it and give it more, because they're only making 2 knots, 2.5 knots, maybe 3. And it's had 1,200 feet of pipe. This is where she sank. There's the boat. There's the dredge. The tug said that he felt the boat, everything slow down, but he just thought it was in shallow water and he was biting current. But and then when the deckhand got up on the pipe and rolled up on that's when they realized they had a problem. This is how it was explained to me, 2 boats. It's a very slow process. This was the day of the inspection. Here's our boat. These were the multiple pictures. You can't take enough pictures for this. And then when you go in the engine room, you scratch your head. You say, they still didn't fix the bilge pumps. They still didn't fix the deck leak. See the deck vent right here? Wherever that is. See the deck vent? It's not connected, so if any water on the deck, it's just gonna pour, because you can see the rust stain that's get into the engine room. They changed the configuration of the hose. They did a little softer hose, made it a little easier to clamp, and they used the right size hose clamps this time. The battery in the battery box. See a bilge pump float switch, right? Where's the bilge pump? But they have 4 bilge pumps. Here's another bilge pump where they painted the bilge. See the bilge pump? So where do you think we were standing on with our lawyers now? That the company had, the boat had sank, we had a death, and they had not taken proactive or preemptive actions to put this boat in some form of compliance with safety. There's your bilge pump. Here's one of the vents on the deck. This was a good picture because it says stern bilge pump is on the toggle switch, which was not hooked up. It wasn't on the panel, they just had bootlegged this wire in there, so they must have had water in the stern so they could pump it up and down as they were using it. And here's your bow, that's the forward bilge, and you can see the same water line in there. And that bilge pump was disconnected too. So as you can see, just because we wear many hats, whether we do yachts and small craft, whether we do, here you go, Kenner, there's your chain. That chain had not moved in location from the time we did, the mud got into it to the time that this was redone. There's no draft, so I think they were using the chain as a stability port starboard list. There's your chain. Hopefully y'all can see that on the internet, but you can see the chain up against the bulkhead. And if you look, you can see the water line right here where they had filled this with water to keep the ballast and to keep that stern of that tug down. That was a pretty determining factor. And here's the new electrical panel. I don't think any of it worked. We couldn't get any of the lights to work. We couldn't get it. This was the shaft log on the face. I don't know if any of you know much about these damn graphite stainless steel flanges. These are PSSs, I think, or PYs. Was it PSS or PY?
They're the same.
They're the same, aren't they? Well, this stainless steel flange is to be flush up against this. So my opinion is that somebody walked in the engine room and that got out of whack. When the guy went down there to check in the engine room, that got out of a line. It wasn't that quarter inch fitting that would have to take hours and hours and hours to do that. And I explained that. So we went and we saw the actual piece, and you can see where it was offset on the carbon block right there. So that was another part that we found that was kind of an obscure thing, but it's something that you figure out as you go. You're looking for all the signs. So here was all of the findings that we found on this truckable. This is what the attorney asked based on this assignment. This is what we looked at. Truckable under 26 feet. Requires no manning requirements. Coast Guards require life jackets, running towing lights, sound producing device, throwable device, fire extinguishers. The vessel had a general alarm installed, but it wasn't required. It had a fire axe, which was installed, it's not required. 4 bilge pumps, and they're all in the off position. No pilot house bilge indicator lights. Because the indicator light could also, be a secondary thing to an alarm. No float switches. On bilge pumps prior to the sinking, you didn't see any anywhere, so no high water alarms, not required but preferred, because I'm not sure where that fits in the rule on high water bilge alarms because was it built ABYC or was it built to that? I was told that when they start building these boats, they put them on the floor, they cut the keel out and start welding, and you get what you get. Starboard hose was laying in the bilge, batteries not secured in the boxes. And from the depositions, the bilge was only checked when they had a crew change And there's a stuffing box was leaking, but was fixed while underway, and there's no record or logbook of that. So that gives you an idea that when you're looking for information. And then there was no insurance survey on records that we could find and no logbooks. These were questions that I asked for. And then we started asking for all this other stuff. Was it all tested? How do they maintain it? And these were the. And then this guy Skinner, he had a few answers, but in the conclusion, remember the lawyer said yesterday, says, in your opinion, or it is your opinion. They were very adamant that I had an opinion. And so the opinion is the bilge pump switches in all position. Not fitted with automatic float switches, no higher water bilge alarms. There were signs of water levels in the lazarette and the ballast and the stern. Chain ballast not accounted for stability test. Stability letter was 2020, not data built. What they had done is they built enough of these boats and they used the same stability letter with just a general or generic for that one boat or that design. They don't have to do it on every one. 24-inch waterline sighted in the 4 bilges. We did not know what happened when it sank. I mean, as you can just go, so that lawyer yesterday was very specific when he said, hey, look, take on your assignment, understand it, and then at the end, you got to put that in your opinion. And I think there was 24 items that we determined were deficiencies. That's what a new shaft seal looked like. The hose bar, I called up, asked them why do they not have a better pin? So that was another finding that was there. But when I had those 24 items there, they started checkboxing them when they went to the other opposing counsel. So if you help with you take the assignment, you take make your own list of findings, you give them questions to ask because you need in your mind to understand what you're being done in your assignment. Look at this. That doesn't have much of a chance of holding on any kind of stepping. So I think between the hose being pulled off, or he got tripped over it, or he stepped on. Or he stepped on the this flange right here. Right there. And they got out of balance because of all the rope and everything. So the shaft was wobbling too. So you had a wobbling shaft with the rope, bent propellers, with bearings wore out. And then you had the rope. So everything underneath was against you. So nothing smooth as if it's in a Bayless or a brand new Viking or MJM or Hinckley. So that was against them. It didn't take much to set those wheels in motion. And this was the bilge pump. This is a regular old 1000 bilge pump. Nothing special about it. Float switch, we only saw one of those. No high water bilge alarms. So if the heavy lift guy would have talked a little bit about how he found it, and the diver would have told us what happened, then the lawyers could have had their lawyers could have had a different defense. Yeah. But being is that we have a picture of the tow, we have a picture of the Coast Guard doing his job, we have ropes, we see all these different scenarios, then we're trying to do for the attorneys. And we're not always we might have been defending the other side, but sometimes when you have to tell your customer or your client that, hey, look, these are the findings that the opposing guy's going to find. The other surveyor, when he works for, so if I was the surveyor working for the dredge company, and he saw this list, he said, yeah, these are pretty reasonable, because he had to do an inspection of the barge or the tugboat also. But now with the case with the dredge, it was just mine safety and the lawyers that were doing that out and the company. So any questions? I don't see any up here that popped up. So I guess Mike, you're giving enough bullshit and give to Gab Randy long enough to accomplish your 45 minutes of goal of times. Is that good? So I'm gonna see y'all here in a little bit on some really fun stuff that we like to do. We talk about you can't make this stuff up. And you're gonna see a couple things. I was asked to talk a little bit about custom construction. I think some guys asked me about that last year to put that in my presentation. Okay. And then we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk a little about HIN numbers and documentation numbers.
Great presentation as always, Lloyd. Thank you.
Who was that? I must have paid him.
CHS
Oh,
Research.
that's Charleston. He knows what, that's old Nick down in Charleston. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Thank you, round of applause.
Very good.
Right, you're gonna leave your kit here?
I'm gonna leave that there.
Yep,
And
that's
if anybody, whoever's next and wants to use the presenter thing,
that's Todd.
Todd, you wanna use the presenter thing?
Is it a pointer?
Yeah.
Or turn, yeah.
Yeah, and it's hooked in, so all you gotta do, Todd, is just link in with your box you're using and
Mike's gonna tee it up for me.
Let's go.
thank you. Yeah,
How
so
does that work?
you just, okay, so it's. Is that you? Or
No.
That's it. Who's that? So that's tiny, this one. Okay, so this goes. All right, hold on. Let's see. There's the pointer, which is that right there.
Okay.
And then here. He's using that.
Okay, I was using pointer.
Hold on, but you can do this, look.
Are you gonna use it?
Once he gets up,
Okay.
hold on. Are you through?
Just about, just about. Oh,
Yeah.
lost it on here.
I don't know why he doesn't have it here either. Well, you can push one of those buttons. It
Okay.
might take a second to sync up, or you might have to push play or something like that.
I can press any button, please press the buttons.
Right, I don't know what's going
You
on
good?
here.
Good
I
luck.
hope so.
I know.
You're a tough act to follow.
No, I'm not.
All right, I'm gonna start again here, Todd. Let's get over there.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that's running on there. It is, okay, good to go.